Good morning. 1 Corinthians 10, it says that the stories that are contained in the Old Testament, true events, the record of God's dealing with mankind in the creation and then elevating one nation from the seed of Abraham to becoming Israel, we're told that those stories remain in our hands today and in the Bible today for our learning, for our encouragement, that we could see God's dealings with them and learn about God and learn about His faithfulness in dealing with them. We could learn, hopefully, from the mistakes they made and not repeat them. As we just read in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, one of Israel's critical failures was that they grumbled and complained, that they didn't learn to have faith in God. They weren't grateful for all the work God had done for them, for all that God had provided for them. And so this morning, we're going to go to Numbers chapter 11 and spend the lesson there. As we've been studying Old Testament foundations, an overview of the Old Testament on Wednesday nights, I've been studying through a lot of the text, and so I think over the next couple of weeks and months, you'll be getting some Old Testament sermons. We don't get to go chapter by chapter, but we want to see the overview of the Old Testament. But in between some of the main points, there's great stories that we can learn a lot from if we pay attention. And that's what we're going to do in Numbers chapter 11 this morning. I apologize for those sitting around me this morning. I've been back for a week now from sea level. My ears still haven't popped, so singing was a bit of a guessing game, but I'll do my best and try to carry on with that anyway without grumbling or complaining. So, Numbers chapter 11. What we have here is, as we've been studying on Wednesday nights, we know that in Exodus, after the 10 plagues, they leave Egypt, and for a couple of months, they're headed in the wilderness until they arrive at Sinai. And so the latter half of Exodus is Moses going up and down the mountain, receiving the 10 commandments and various parts of the law, the details of the tabernacle. And then Leviticus is still there in the vicinity of Mount Sinai. And it's not until Numbers chapter 10 that we learn that Israel is about to leave. They've been there for over a year now, or approximately a year, right around Mount Sinai, receiving communication and details of the law from God. And so here's where we are in Numbers chapter 11. They have just departed for the first time after being given the law. And we know they don't last very long because chapter 13 is where they send in the spies who give the bad report, and that's when God makes His judgment that you will not inherit the promised land. I will wait and the next generation will. So they didn't last very long. That's where we are chronologically. So in chapter 11 of the book of Numbers, they have just barely left Mount Sinai. They have just barely received the covenant and the law from God, and already they're starting off on the wrong foot. If we start in Numbers chapter 11, beginning in verse 1, we read in the first couple of verses that they really set the tone negatively. It's no wonder why only 2 or 3 chapters later, they are already being condemned to die in the wilderness for the next generation to take over. Starting in verse 1, now the people became like those who complain of adversity in the hearing of the Lord. And right there, that tells you what's going on among the people, what the popular opinion, what the general vibe or mood of the people is. Even though they've been freed miraculously by the power of God from the slavery and bondage of Egypt, they're complaining about adversity. And we like to think that God will give us a break. You know, when things are bad, when the chips are down, when our circumstances are bad, when we're undergoing distress, well, God will understand if my language gets a little more colorful, or if I lose my temper a little more easier. I'm under a lot of stress right now. And this verse right here tells me God doesn't care about that. We think that I'm not myself when I'm under a burden of stress or pressure. Adversity shows us exactly for who we are. And so they're acting like people that are under distress, and they are not showing their best selves here. And I like what it says here. It says they complain in the hearing of the Lord. Now, we all are guilty of grumbling under our breath, right? Anybody ever done this with your husband or your wife, where you have a conversation and you're kind of going back and forth, arguing a little bit, and as you turn to walk away, you say something, but you don't necessarily intend for them to hear it? kind of grumbling a little bit, and we all do this. It's human nature. We like to say things that rather than confront the situation or talk directly to the person, we just kind of turn and walk away. We want them to hear that we're still saying something, but we don't necessarily want to say it to their face. And this is what Israel is doing. Would God have still been upset if they were just in their minds, mentally speaking to themselves, discontent or grumbling or complaining? Yes, God still would have been disappointed with that, but I think this takes on a whole different meaning because they wanted God to hear this. Now, they weren't going to talk to him face to face. They weren't going to address it directly by saying, God, we're not comfortable with some things. We have some complaints. Will you hear us? Will you listen to us? No, they're just going to complain. In his hearing, they want him to hear them complaining. So that takes on a whole nother level of negativity. It's not just that they were internally or amongst, within their own minds dissatisfied. They were complaining. They were complaining of adversity in the hearing of the Lord. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled. And the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. And I'll make a few comments on that right there. This is actually a little bit of mercy on the part of God. It wasn't right in the middle of the camp where most of the people were. And we know from a few chapters later, God is perfectly willing to wipe them all out and just start over with Moses. So we know what God is willing to do. We know that God is patient enough. He doesn't need these people. He can start over with anybody he wants. He can start over with any one family descended from Abraham. So this is a great deal of mercy on the part of God to just go to the outskirts of the camp, it says. And so the fire comes and it says here, consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. And why the outskirts? Again, maybe an act of mercy to not be right in the middle of them. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe speculation. There's always this trend of the troublemakers like to sit in the back, don't they? Right, Jason? No, just kidding. But it's always the bad kids are at the back of the bus. They're in the back row of the classroom. I don't know. Maybe these are the people that they're the troublemakers. They want to hang on the fringe. They don't want to be in the middle of it all. I don't know. But nonetheless, God is sending fire on the outskirts of the camp. And so the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died out. So they're saved. Again, mercy from God. Considering what they deserved and that God would have been perfectly willing to destroy all of them, this shows us that God is still patient. Even in his anger, there is restraint, there is patience, there is mercy. So we learn a lot about God just in these first two verses here. And we learn plenty about Israel. So the name of that place was called Taberah. And my footnote says burning, because of the fire of the Lord burned among them. And the rabble who were among them had greedy desires. And also the sons of Israel wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? Now, who is this rabble in verse 4? I don't think that the congregation wandering in the wilderness here is 100% descendants of Abraham. I think there's some people mixed in with them. In Exodus chapter 12, if you'll notice when they're departing Egypt, it says in Exodus chapter 12, verse 38, and a mixed multitude also went up with them, along with flocks and herds, a very large number of livestock. So there were some people, Egyptians probably, or people of a mixed heritage, that were going with them. I think that's probably what this rabble has reference to. I think Leviticus 24 also makes mention of someone blaspheming the name of God. And it says his mother was a Hebrew or Israelite, but his father was Egyptian. And so there certainly were people from other nationalities, other races, that probably had other religious backgrounds mixed in with them. And I think that's who this rabble is. And they had greedy desires. This idea of a greedy desire, a covetous desire, I think it's something that it's a craving. Other translations say that, a craving. I think that's what the English Standard Version says. When you think of a craving, I would suggest to you this is more like an addiction where you're looking for a fix, something that will not satisfy though. You have an itch that cannot be scratched. It is a desire for something that will not be satisfied. No matter if they got it or not, they would not be satisfied. I think that's the idea of the greediness. At the heart or core of greed is dissatisfaction. So this rabble, this group of people that is mixed in among the Israelites, They are dissatisfied, and this is spreading like cancer throughout this congregation. Because it says, also the sons of Israel wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? You see how it's spreading. They are not standing up to defend God. And that is something I think we fail to do sometimes. We fail to remember that as ambassadors for Christ, as his representatives in this world, it is our responsibility to stand up and defend God when others slander him or criticize him as cruel or false or made up. The people of God need to stand up and defend him. We need to not be ashamed to say, I am with God. I believe in him wholeheartedly, and I am one of his. I belong to him, and I will tell of his goodness. They failed to do that here. In verse 5, it's funny how the past can be rewritten so easily. We remember the fish which we used to eat in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. But now our appetite is gone. It's almost like they're saying our soul is gone, and I can empathize with that. I love food, and if variety is the spice of life, and if I was limited to just one food choice, I can sympathize with that. But it's funny how distorted their memory of Egypt was. They're remembering selectively the foods they had, but they're forgetting the bigger picture, that they were slaves, that their newborn sons were being murdered at birth. They kind of forgot the bigger picture here. It's funny when Satan gets into our minds how selective our memory of the past can become. We remember, oh yeah, before I was a Christian or before I started going to church, I remember some of the good things. I remember I could do this or that and how fun that was. And you're forgetting that you were a slave to sin. You're forgetting that you were headed down a path destined to destruction and eternal fire. Don't forget the big picture. Don't listen to the lies of Satan. They're selectively remembering, and now our appetite is gone. There is nothing at all to look at except this manna that had been sustaining your life for over a year now. They are not grateful. Now the manna, and it goes on to describe it like coriander seed, and it describes in verse 8 how they would prepare it into cakes, and it says in verse 9, when the dew fell on the camp at night, the manna would fall with it. And so God is not pleased at all. They are not grateful. They are discontent. And that's why it says they have greedy desires. And this is going to come to a head. This is going to boil over into a bigger situation as we move on into the next section here. I want you to notice, though, when it comes to grumbling or complaining, as we read in 1 Corinthians 10, we're supposed to learn from the mistakes they made. We're supposed to learn and do better. And one of the things identified as one of their key failures in 1 Corinthians 10 was, don't complain like some of them did. God destroyed them for it. God has zero tolerance for complaining, for dissatisfaction, for ingratitude. And that's a lesson we need to learn. And one thing we need to see about grumbling and complaining is it has a negative impact on others. I think in a marriage, even when you're not grumbling or complaining about your spouse, you're just not a fun person to be around, not really good company to be around when you're just finding one thing or another to complain or grumble about. It creates a negative environment, and it has a negative impact on those around you. And that's what we see here in verse 10. I want you to notice how all the grumbling, all the complaining, what impact it was having on a good and righteous man like Moses. Not perfect man, but Moses was no spiritual weakling. He was a pretty strong pillar of faith here. But notice how it's bringing him down in verse 10. Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, each man at the doorway of his tent. And again, when we notice the details, I think we can make some great application. It says they complained in the hearing of God. It specified that for a reason. Now here it specifies they were crying or weeping at the doorway of their tent. They are broadcasting this. They want people to see this. I've said this before, and I'll say it all the time. When it comes to Facebook or any type of social media, don't just get on there to gripe. Don't just get on there to write. Limit the kinds of things you put out there, and limit the amount of time you spend looking at it. It's addictive, I know. But most of what I see on Facebook lately is negativity. is grumbling, is complaining about one thing or another. You don't need that in your life. So take it with a grain of salt. Take it in small amounts. But don't become hooked on it, because it's just a breeding ground for negativity. And we like to think that one generation's problems are greater than the previous generations. And, I saw this picture. It talked about how people are looking at their phones like this, all on a train, all looking at their phones, ignoring each other, how we're all mindless zombies. And then the next picture was black and white from the 30s. It was all people on a train with their newspaper in their face. Things aren't that different. There is nothing new under the sun. They had their version of Facebook. It wasn't on the computer, but it was, let's go out on our doorway where everyone can see us, and let's start weeping to make a display. See, they're making a scene here, and it's having a toll on Moses. He says in verse 11, so Moses said to the Lord, why hast thou been so hard on thy servant? Why have I not found favor in thy sight, that thou hast laid the burden of all this people on me? Was it I who conceived all this people? Was it I who brought them forth, that thou shouldst say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a nursing infant to the land, which thou didst swear to their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give all this people? For they weep before me, saying, give us meat that we may eat. And Moses is telling them, look, they're coming to me with their problems. They're looking to me for an answer, and I can't take care of this many people. God, why are they my problem? I didn't give birth to them. They're not my children, all 600,000 of them. How am I going to fix this, God? And one thing I want you to notice here is God is going to offer a solution to Moses. We find kind of two different ways of dealing with a complaint. With Israel, they just didn't have enough variety of food. So rather than go to God directly, or rather than go to Moses and say, can you speak to the Lord? Can you appeal to God? Can you go to him directly? They just complain about God rather than deal with the problem head on. It said in verse 10, the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly because of their tears. God isn't swayed emotionally just because of our tears. In fact, if they're tears based upon greed or selfishness, he's angered by it. What does Moses do? Moses goes directly to God. Yeah, Moses is burdened, and it's okay. It tells us here that it's okay to feel like you're overwhelmed. It's okay to feel like you've got a great problem in your life. It's okay to go to God and say, look, I need help with this. But you better do it the way Moses did. Go directly to God. Air your grievances out before God. Don't just grumble and complain about God in front of everybody else. Go directly to him. It's okay to cry. It's okay to have tears of grief. It's okay to feel overwhelmed and overburdened. But take that to God. Don't just complain about it. And so he says in verse 14, I alone am not able to carry all this people because it is too burdensome for me. So if thou art willing to deal thus with me, please kill me at once, if I have found favor in thy sight, and do not let me see my wretchedness. Now you didn't mishear that. He says, God, kill me right now. It's reminiscent of Jeremiah, who said, I wish I was never born. Or Elijah, who said, that's it, that's enough. Take my life now. They pushed Moses to the limit where he would prefer death at this point. This is the impact that grumbling, complaining, whining has on those around you. It saps energy, it saps the life out of people, literally. Moses had had enough. But I want you to notice the way the Lord responds to him when we start in verse 16. God answers Moses and offers some solutions here. The Lord therefore said to Moses, gather for me 70 men from the elders of Israel, whom you know to be elders of the people and their officers, and bring them to the tent of meeting, and let them take their stand there with you. Then I will come down and speak with you there, and I will take of the Spirit who is upon you, and I will put him upon them, and they shall bear the burden of the people with you, so that you shall not bear it alone. And say to the people, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat. For you have wept in the ears of the Lord, saying, oh, that someone would give us meat to eat, for we were well off in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. And so, first of all, for Moses, he offers a real solution. Why don't you appoint 70 elders, and they're going to help bear the burden with you. I'll put my Spirit on them the way I have on you, and so they can help bear the burden. God answers his prayer, if you will, if you'd call that a prayer. But again, I can't help but notice the difference in the way Moses and Israel handled their complaint. God may well have said to Moses, I'm sorry, you're going to have to keep doing this on your own. But at least Moses took his complaint to the face of God, directly to him, rather than complain about it. So he offers Moses a real solution, but I want you to notice something here, how he answers the request or complaint of Israel. He says in verse 18, say to the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow you shall eat meat. For you have wept in the ears of the Lord, saying, oh, that someone would give us meat to eat, for we were well off in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall eat not 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, nor 10 days, nor 20 days, but a whole month. It's almost as if God is having to prove himself again to them, sadly. I'll prove it. I'll give you a whole month of meat until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you and have wept before him, saying, why did we ever leave Egypt? He says, I'm going to give you exactly what you want, and you're going to hate it. You're going to regret it. This is the way sin works. We think we want something, and we think that if I just had this in my life, there's this one missing ingredient to my contentment. If I only had this, then I'd be happy. If I only had this, then I could be everything God wants me to be. If I only had this one thing, a little more money, someone in my life, another friend, or a better job, or if I only had. How often do we think there's that one thing we need? And God says, you don't need that. If you reject me, it's not going to do any good. Again, it's this idea of a greedy desire. They want something, but it won't satisfy them when they get it. That's the way sin works. When we reject God and say, I need this, sometimes God lets us have that. And it becomes a burden to us. It becomes something that ruins us. So he says, I'll give you quail, I'll give you meat, I'll give you so much it'll come out your nose. You'll loathe it. You'll be sick of it before you're done. But Moses, like I said, wasn't perfect. In verse 21, he has a little bit of a hesitation here. Even Moses, again, he's not complaining. We got to give Moses credit. He's not complaining. But even Moses, has to ask God, how? How can you do this? But Moses said, the people among whom I am are 600,000 on foot. Yet thou hast said, I will give them meat in order that they may eat for a whole month. Should flocks and herds be slaughtered for them to be sufficient for them? Or should all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them to be sufficient? The Lord said to Moses, is the Lord's power limited? Now you shall see whether my word will come true for you or not. How many times has God been proven true? And the same is true of us. You just wait and see. Jesus said the fool builds his house on the sand. He will come to ruin by not trusting. We'll see how that plays out. Jesus said there is a narrow path that leads to heaven. There is a broad way, and many are on it that lead to destruction. There is heaven, there is hell that awaits us at the end of this life. Just wait and see, God says. Wait and see whether that's true. And so he says to Moses, is my power limited? There's nothing I can't do. I'll show you. You just wait and see what's going to happen. And so in verse 24, Moses went out and told the people the words of the Lord, and he gathered 70 men from the elders of the people and stationed them around the tent. And here we have where the Lord comes down in the cloud and imparts his spirit on these 70. And it says in verse 27, when the Spirit rested on them, they prophesied, and then they did not do it again. But it says in verse 26, kind of one of those odd stories here, but it tells us a little bit about the character of Moses. 2 men, Eldad and Medad, in verse 26, were outside of the camp, and they were among the 70, but they weren't in the group. They were somewhere else. And so the Spirit rested on them. And they prophesied in the camp. So verse 27, a young man ran and told Moses and said, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp. And Joshua, the son of Nun, the attendant of Moses from his youth, answered and said, Moses, my Lord, restrain them. But Moses said to him, are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord would put a spirit upon them. And Moses returned to the camp, both he and the elders of Israel. Moses was a pretty humble guy. He said, I wish everybody could prophesy. I don't want this all to myself. We got to look around the congregation, and there should be no room for jealousy when other people are doing good things. The more, the better. Would that everybody could serve as elder, deacon, evangelist, Bible class teacher in any capacity. The more, the better. And I love the attitude of Moses here. So God answers and says, okay, to Moses, I'm going to give you what you need. To Israel, it says, I'm going to give you what you think you need, and you're going to hate it. So let's see what happens. We get quail, some more quail, and more quail on top of that. In verse 31, now there went forth a wind from the Lord, and it brought quail from the sea, and let them fall beside the camp, about a day's journey on this side and a day's journey on the other side, all around the camp, and about 2 cubits deep on the surface of the ground. That's about 3 feet deep. There's some disparity in the translations. There's some differences, whether this is, some even say maybe an owl. Most modern English translations say quail, though there's some dispute or debate whether this might even be locust instead. And I find that to be ironic, if that's the case, that it was locust who was a plague to Egypt, but it here is a form of sustenance for them. But I'm going to go with quail, just because that's what it says in my Bible, and that seems to be the best sounding option in my mind. So I'm going to go with quail. That's what I'd prefer to eat out of those 3 choices. But whatever it was, he gives them a lot. A lot. And also he said, I'm going to give it to you tomorrow. That's what he told Moses. God wasn't waiting. God wanted to show and prove to them yet again. He wanted to prove how powerful he was. So he says, tomorrow I'm going to give you so much, and a whole month's worth. And so it says in verse 31 that, verse 32, and the people spent all day and all night and all the next day and gathered the quail. He who had gathered least gathered 10 omers. I think 1 omer is the amount that you could stack on a donkey. So just think 10 of those. This is hundreds of gallons by modern measurements. For whatever measurement that is, it's basically saying even the worst at gathering quail had buckets, piles and piles of quail meat. Nobody was lacking. And they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. They didn't necessarily cook everything. They didn't have preservatives or chemicals. Maybe they're better off that way. I don't know. But they dried things in the sun was typically how they would keep meat for long periods of time. Kind of like the way you do with fillets of fish or jerky. That was a primitive way of kind of saving it for later, is drying it out in the sun. I think that's what it means when they were spreading them out all over the camp. Now, verse 33 is something I didn't see coming when I was reading this chapter the first time. While the meat was still between their teeth. And again, a very specific detail for a reason. While the meat was still between their teeth, before it was chewed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people, and the Lord struck the people with a very severe plague. So the name of that place was called Kibroth Hattaavah, because there they buried the people who had been greedy. And that footnote for the name of the place was graves of the gluttonous, graves of the greedy, or grave of craving, is essentially what that name means. On first glance, first reading, this might seem like God is fickle. Here's some meat. I'm going to kill you for eating it now. But really, think about what's going on here. God said, I'm going to give you 30 days worth. It's kind of like when he gave the manna. Don't gather any on the Sabbath. Well, they did it anyway. Or don't gather more than 1 day's worth. And they gathered piles and piles of it, so it went rancid. I think that's what's going on here. God said, I'm going to give you 30 days of this, yet for 2 whole days, they're going crazy just gathering it up in big piles that they don't even need or couldn't even eat. Some commentators suggest this was kind of a horrific sight. It was kind of like a ravenous crowd, maybe even just eating it raw. This was probably something that God looked at and said, this is disgusting. I told you I'd give you 30 days of this. Why are you going crazy like this? Either way, I take solace in the fact that verse 34 specifies the ones they buried that day were the people who had been greedy. So the people who died were the ones who were greedy, the ones who had the cravings, the one who were dissatisfied with God. That's the takeaway here. And so this wraps up chapter 11 in the book of Numbers. Now we know that just 2 chapters from now, they're going to get to the edge of the promised land, and they're really going to show they haven't learned their lesson. How predictable was God? God was very consistent. They should have known the outcome of complaining. They didn't learn. The question for us is, will we learn? This story, this chapter is here for us to learn from. I hope we take away some lessons about grumbling or complaining. It's not a good thing in your life. It has a negative impact on others around you. I mean, just think about it. Do you like to be around someone who's constantly complaining and grumbling? And we learn that God provides us everything. Let's be thankful for all the times we thought we needed something, and God said, I'm not going to give it to you, because we wouldn't be satisfied with it. God gives us what we need, not what we think we need. That's the greatest lesson I learned from this chapter. And so I want to offer an invitation song now as we conclude the lesson this morning and turn to number 822. You might think there's all kinds of things you need in your life, but God has provided for your greatest need. Jesus came, the perfect Son of God, the unblemished Lamb of God. He died on the sins so that you could be forgiven of your sins. That is what you need. There's all kinds of things you might want, but that is what you need. And if you are not in contact with the grace of God, if you have not been washed by the blood of the Lamb, or if you have fallen from that grace, if you have fallen from your relationship with God, that is what you need in your life, is to be right by God. If we can help you, come talk to me, come find me, or come forward and make that need known right now as we stand and sing.